you so much for joining us this evening as we come together for the Denison Presidential Art Lecture. I think that's close, isn't it? That's close enough. You'll meet Mrs. Denison in just a moment. But thank you for coming and exploring a moment where we think together and have a special guest on our campus that will lead us in those thoughts. When I came to Lipscomb 9 years ago, one of the things I said then and still believe now is that you just can't be a great liberal arts university if you don't have great art, music, and theater. And I still think that's true, and we've worked over those 9 years to improve all three of those areas so that they represent that part of the liberal arts school. So thank you for coming tonight and being a part of this continuing effort and this continuing focus on the arts, which sometimes in the world of the workplace and all the challenges of education and all the pressures to do nothing but just prepare people for a job, sometimes this gets left a bit behind. And yet when you think about the quality of life and all the moments that are going to be special along the way, this is pretty important stuff. And so we appreciate both your interest, your engagement, and your being here this evening. Let me introduce Warren Green, who chairs the art department, and he will introduce our special guest this evening.
On behalf of the Department of Art, welcome to the Gene and Emily Denison Presidential Lectures series on art and art history. We wish to thank Marty and Jane Kittrell and Gene Denison and President Lowry for making this possible. And could y'all please stand? Our speaker tonight is Jessica Stockwell. She was born in Seattle, Washington, and studied painting at the University of Victoria. She received her MFA from Yale University. She is the chair of the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Chicago. She previously served as director of professional writing studies and sculpture at Yale University. Her work has been shown extensively throughout the United States and Europe, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, National Academy Museum in New York, the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Saatchi Collection in London, and Venice Biennale. Jessica's work is included in numerous collections, including Museum of Fine Art in Boston, Art Institute of Chicago, Birmingham Museum of Art, the British Museum in London, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Awards include from institutions like the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship and has received grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts and the National Endowments for the Arts. Would you please welcome Jessica?
This is an image of a work called Color Jam. It was a few years ago in Chicago, and so this is kind of more or less, contemporary, close to what I'm working on now. And then I'm going to jump way back, and the images will go, start from a work from a long time ago, kind of chronologically move. And they're set to move like this, so that I can talk and show more images than I would otherwise. But the Color Jam piece was commissioned by the Chicago Loop Alliance, that I didn't actually touch anything. So here, this is jumping way back to when I was a college student, and I wanted to give you some sense of how the work developed. I started as a painter, and I studied with a sculptor, Maury Baden. I grew up in Canada, so I was born in the States. And Maury was an American sculptor who still lives on Vancouver Island. And he was critical of the unstretched canvas, and I was very invested in the materiality of things. And I'm sorry, I can't control this because I thought I was going to stop and start it, but I'll have to adjust. So I here there's toilet paper and a kind of plastic bag sandwiched together with paper. And I started I was attached to the materiality of things. I think I made 1 or 2 paintings that were on stretched canvas. But I liked the materiality of the canvas. I liked mixing stuff with the paint. I liked the materiality of it all. So I started to put things in relationship to each other on the wall. And at which point, the wall became part of the work. And when the work itself was no longer rectilinear, like a painting, I realized that the edges of the wall framed the work. Much like, and then I realized that architecture framed the work. I started to put things from the wall on the floor and put things on the floor in front of the wall. And I was very interested in questions of boundary. And a lot of these works use building materials. This one is metal studs that are used for building walls. I became interested in what the walls were made of, and interested in how the skin of architecture, the skin of rooms, presents a fiction, and the surface of a painting provides the possibility for fiction. There's an illusionistic potential in any surface. And so I was using materials that were used in building architecture, and you'll see as the images roll along, I have poked holes in the building in various places. And I'm interested in the formality of things and how form is meaningful. My work is not driven by narrative. There's no story in my head that I'm then illustrating or that's driving the use of the materials. I'm interested in how the material feels and what the material is, and how the evocative, illusionistic potential of surface mixes with the material experience of objects and of color and moving around things. So this work was a work at the Dia Center for the Arts in 1995, I think. And it's quite distinct from the series of works you just saw that were standalone objects in the studio. And the process of coming to these different works is very different. This work at Dia requires that I work with a lot of people and have some plans and ideas that I can share with people who will help me make the work. And the work in the studio, I'm alone. I don't hire people to work with me in the studio. And I don't have to know what I'm doing. I don't have to put words to what I'm doing to share with people. So it can be I can make something and not like it and turn it over or cut it in half or throw it away even. And when I've signed on to do a big work like this one, I have to kind of at least appear as if I know what I'm doing and be finished in time for the opening. So there are very different ways of working that inform each other, and that I really appreciate both. I appreciate the more private way of working, and I like the more pressured way of working. But in all cases, these smaller pieces like this one is hung on the wall, so it's made of things, but it is in the place of painting. Anything you hang on the wall becomes kind of pictorial. You stand back from it, and it kind of flattens out. And the larger work, like the two that you've seen thus far, they also are involved in a kind of picture making. Though the relationship between the picture and the dimensionality of the work is more complicated. It involves the body, not just the head. And this is actually just a little postcard that I'd like to watch. It's got the image of that previous piece in it. So this work, there's a kind of, it's against the wall, and there's a kind of vantage point from which things seem to come together and be organized. And as you move, there are vantage points where things kind of fall apart. But I'm interested in how physical decisions and physical qualities, and both physical and sculptural and pictorial and graphic are evocative in metaphoric ways for all kinds of parts of being human. So, like, starting at the kind of very beginning, being interested in questions of boundary, where the image begins and ends, how it's framed, and how it bleeds out of the frame, and how the skin of a painting and the skin of architecture are evocative. Though that's all kind of content. You know, in any building, there's wiring and plumbing and heating ducts behind the skin of the wall. And this room is painted a particular color, and it evokes a particular kind of feeling being in here. It creates for us a real circumstance. But it kind of disguises the structure of the building and all the services that we need from the building. That's a kind of illusion, but it's also real life. It's the room we live in. So I've been very interested in the relationship between the fantasy, or I use words like fiction, but there's no fiction story. It's a fictive experience of space, a fictive set of, it evokes feeling that is not tied to material, though it's material that serves to evoke the feeling. And there's a question of kind of boundary there, what's real and what's subjective, emotional storytelling. And so in those ways, the work is consistent. This was a show called Tabletop Sculpture. This is a collection of things that are not, many of them are not tied to the wall, though you can see there's many things still tied to the wall. And there's Anthony Caro is somebody whose work I really liked. He's a sculptor who works with a kind of picture making in space, where things are layered but flatten out when you stand back from them. And in this particular show, this is work by many other people on the walls, and I invited other people to contribute work to my show. And I felt that if I was going to try and make things that were not tied to the architecture, that were kind of sculpture standing in the middle of the room, that I needed some other kind of context. So I was exploring context in a different way. And the context was many of my peers. There were former teachers, former students, friends, family members who are artists, my husband and my cousin, and I was proposing, and artists who I didn't know but know their work really well. I don't know Cindy Sherman, but she was in the show. So it was a kind of an array of people who provided another kind of context, a social and shared conversation context instead of a physical one. So when I was younger and started kind of asking questions about context and painting and kind of insisting that the work have an immediacy, that it be in my space, not only framed off by the edges of a painting, I at that time felt really unhappy I felt really double about the status of art. On the one hand, it renders things really special, and the experience of art is heightened because we separate it from life and we put it on pedestals or frame it, and we announce that it's important, and we take time to look at it in white spaces, often separated from other things. And I appreciate that intensity that our conventions give that experience. And on the other hand, having things so removed renders them less powerful in a way. I mean, I think part of what really matters about making art is that it's in a way mundane. It isn't special. It's what we do to make sense of being alive. We make things and we process information and how things are significant by putting things together in a physical way. So I mean, I still have these feelings, but especially when I was younger, I was kind of infuriated at that distance that the art circumstance provided things. And so that's how I came to be kind of grappling with all of these questions. And this piece was made with a lot of Lego and Duplo, and also shipping containers, and it's a kind of shift in scale, but doing the same thing, stacking up shipping containers that are rectilinear, kind of building blocks, and then also working with little tiny ones. And what just I got lost. So there's that kind of abstract expressionist moment that the light's pointing at there. When I was a student, abstract expressionism was a bad word, and I think there still is some of that. I don't know how it is here, but there's a kind of like expectation that feeling and personal feeling isn't appropriate in art, that art is a public thing and it should be about something bigger than your person. And I think that's true. I think art is a public thing, and that in order to be cared about publicly, it does need to be bigger than your person. But it's also true that we all have feelings, and our personal lives are in some ways quite similar. You know, we all have to deal with our natures in order to live with one another and be civilized. And I think that art is a place that joins conversation about emotional life and intellectual life. So I really appreciate that about art. This work was called Sam Ran Over Sand, or Sand Ran Over Sam. And I was asking myself with the title about the place of narrative in my work. And I don't think narrative is the right word to describe what I do. Like I said earlier, I really don't have a verbal narrative going on in my head. And narrative is tied, I think, to fiction and literature and comics and film as a way to understand the world. But in a way, I think that there's a kind of filmic quality to a work like this one. This is still the same work, where you move around in the space and different kind of pictorial moments add up in a filmic way. And I think that that materials have character. So I was proposing that character, sand and sand, the character has a kind of sequential eventfulness in my work that could be understood as a kind of narrative. This work is called Landscape Linoleum, and it was in Belgium. It was a temporary piece in a sculpture park, Middelheim Sculpture Park, and these kind of cast bronze sculptures on pedestals are part of their permanent collection, and my piece was an ephemeral work. So these colored pathways were carved out of the grass, but there were also pathways that are part of the park that people move through. And I was treating the artifice of the park as related to or parallel to the artifice of a gallery. In a gallery, the White Cube Gallery, which is kind of art convention, there's a kind of the proposal that the gallery is neutral. But we know galleries aren't neutral. They're commercial proposals. The museums serve certain power structures. They're not really neutral. And life isn't neutral. Life doesn't stop. But when you walk into a gallery, there's kind of the proposal that time is stopped and there's just a stasis. But in the work, I've done a few works outside. The one that you started that you saw, and then the Middelheim piece. Every circumstance has its. I mean, I'm not making work in the middle of the woods. That would be another kind of circumstance. They're all pieces that are made in relationship to cultural constructions of one kind or another. So the park was, it pretends to be nature, but it's not really natural. The lawn isn't natural, in a place like Mittelheim in Europe, that there hasn't been wild woods there for centuries. So it's a kind of proposal of nature. And in that way, the surface of the park, the grass and the kind of bank of trees that was made against, are like the surface of an interior room. And I kind of work against the surface of the thing, kind of propose my thing, that's the ground for the work. This was a video that didn't do anything, just a blank blue screen. And these are a lot of white appliances that are plugged in, so there's kind of some humming that comes from them. I don't know if you know Robert Ryan's work, kind of white on white, it's kind of a play with that. And this is a big fireplace, so it's eventful in a way, but not much happens. It's just a big fireplace, it's kind of warm color. And I think my work, I mean, I've often used electricity, I've used fruit, there's fruit in this piece, fans, which are kind of both still and moving. They appear still because they're moving so fast, but the air moves, and the air moves. So my work exists in a place of stasis. It's part of a kind of picture making, and pictures propose stasis. I think part of my ambition is to stop time because it's frightening and it keeps going and that life ends. But of course, I'm not successful in that venture. And but the work does participate in, I think, a kind of cultural effort to stop time. I think picture making is a kind of cultural effort to propose a static rendition of life that is otherwise always moving. But by using electricity and fruit and fans, there's an acknowledgement inside of the work, a kind of breaking of that proposal inside of the work, which is similar to piercing the skin of the canvas or piercing the skin of walls. It's like acknowledging the structure that holds the work and that's presented, but at the same time relying on it and caring for it. So this is another outdoor work that was commissioned by a bank in Switzerland. This work happened very quickly, and it was alongside a work that was commissioned by a public, by the government of France that took 3 or 4 years to make. So it's in the structures that invite work really influence what happens. And so working alone in the studio, I can have the illusion of autonomy because we're never really any of us autonomous. And my work relies on many histories and lots of people's work before mine. And then I have some place, I'm very fortunate to show the work and have places to exhibit. So knowing that the work has a life and a place to go influences what I do in the studio. I don't pretend that I actually am working all alone, but I do value not being alone in the studio and feel that I think a part of what I value about making art is that it affords the opportunity to notice my own the power of decision making that is mine. And there are not too many places in life where you're really faced with that. Most jobs, having a job, you go to work and the job kind of dictates what you do and what needs to be accomplished. And there's a pleasure in that, and it's easier to go to, I teach, and it's easier to go and, teach my class and respond to my students than it is to be in the studio where no one's told me what to do and I really have to invent the whole agenda. But it's also really exhilarating for exactly that reason that I invent my own agenda. And I think that art is really important for that reason, that it lets people know that that's a possibility as a human being, and that the various structures and that we work within, whether it's an art painting structure or a bureaucratic structure, the various structures that we work with and live with are invented by us and can therefore be changed. And since our thinking is so informed by the structures we live in, the methods for building things that are part of the economy, computer software, structures you're thinking, somebody else made it. I think art is a place where, for noticing those structures and opening up room for things to be otherwise. So this is, these are light fixtures from, the equivalent of Home Depot and in Visby and down in Gotland in Sweden. And a little hose that's where water's coming out onto this piece of concrete. And that event was all outside but fed by systems inside the building. This is a kind of in-between work. It was made in relationship to a building in Denver. I'm just forgetting the name of that building. It's a new building built by Lipscomb where there's no right angles. And they invited me to make a work as part of a group show for the opening of that museum. And I didn't want my work to bleed into that building because that building was so particular and eccentric. The architect had insisted that he was the artist. I didn't want to, so I made a building that was responsive to the angles of that building, but insisted that the thing also be autonomous. And these are some monoprints. It's a hydraulic press that makes these, that squeezes things together. So there's fake fur and paint, plywood plates. This is the texture of kind of part of the board plate, and then the colored parts have routing that had paint inside of them that was squeezed into the paper. These were made in relationship to a work that was a public work in Madison Square Park, but I think images of that will come up next. But in all of the work I make, even the bigger installations, the piece in the park, the piece in the city, this is the Madison Square Park piece, there's always a kind of tension between my work being complete and distinct from the place it's situated, and being, but not being able to cut it apart from the place. And so I don't use the word environment. I don't make environments. I don't want you to walk into a space and kind of forget what's outside, or I really love to make use of daylight and to be able to see out the window. I like my works to, in this case, it's kind of in an enclosed patch of grass that's like a park, but then it crosses over the path into another patch of grass, and then you stand on those bleachers and look down at a planted garden. So I like my work to, if it was a coloring book, I don't like to stay in the lines. I like the various brackets and structures that I'm making work in relationship to be transgressed. So my work kind of floats. It's a thing distinct, floating kind of in relationship to the structures that have been proposed by something else, somebody else, some other group of people, structures, conventions. This work is called Peer Out to See, P-E-E-R, peer, but there's kind of like a big pier, like the other kind of pier. It's like a pier usually out, sticking out into a body of water that kind of sticks into the space. That's algae growing on a kind of shallow pond of a star. This next few slides is an odd show that was for me a really wonderful opportunity. Ian Barry at the Tang Museum invited me to co-curate with him, and it was on the heels of the tabletop sculpture show that he saw. And we invited 60 other artists to be in the show, and I designed the infrastructure. So this is a series of pedestals. This big one is like 12 by 12 feet, so it becomes more like an inside-out room. But the smallest one is a kind of 2 by 2 foot pedestal. And there's Jim Hodges' wallpaper, Joan Snyder's painting, Jack Whitman's painting, Richard Rizak's sculpture. But this pink thing here is my sculpture. It kind of blends into being a platform that's a pedestal for Richard Rizak's sculpture. And the one corner of the room was red, as you can see here. The other corner was green. These are Cheryl Donegan paintings on the green, and I just forgot the name of another painter. And Jorge Pardo's chandeliers, Charles Wong's sculpture. Sherry Levine was the other painter there. So one corner was cool and the other was hot, and I was exploring kind of display, pedestals, carpet. There was a bleachers you could sit in to look at works that were up high. It was a show that was in upstate New York, so not that many people saw it. But I hope that sometime we'll do something related to it again. It was called The Jewel Thief. This was a project I was invited to do at the Aldrich Museum, where they had a tree that they cut down in their backyard. And it was an ash tree that had cured for a while and cut up into boards, and these were all screen printed. And this is also a project that kind of opens up areas that I kind of like to explore some more. Growing up in Vancouver, British Columbia, the Native American art there is kind of very present, part of the culture, part of the landscape, it's part of my experience. And I really love the formal qualities of that work. I don't know, it's full of iconography that's not so known to me, but about animals and hierarchies, I think. One of the things I've been thinking about in relationship to that work is that there's an oval shape that's repeated that kind of structures formally the work. And the oval references the eye, and the edges of the eye frame are looking at things quite differently than the rectilinear frame of easel painting that, is how we understand picture making and framing. And easel painting and rectilinear framing kind of references windows and architecture and grids, city grids. But the oval shape of the eye on poles, kind of freestanding, is a whole different way to understand picture making. This is all still the ash tree. I made two screens too that sat in relationship to each other. This other way of picture making I find interesting. So I think I lived in New York for 12 years and then moved to Connecticut, where I taught for 12 years and lived in a kind of suburban neighborhood in Connecticut. And when I moved to Connecticut, I realized that when you have a piece of property in a house like that, you step back and you kind of look at your house and your garden, and you understand the edges of your property to be kind of like the picture of your house and garden. And you don't really notice, the neighbors so much. You're kind of looking at what's in the lines of your property, and I think that's related to picture making, that ownership and is related to picture making in some way. So thinking about this oval shape and the totem poles and other structures of ownership, I think is interesting, and I'm on board with that. These are more recent pieces from my studio. This was like when I first moved to Chicago a couple years ago. And you can see I use a lot of plastic, bits and pieces of plastic, plastic mat, dog bowl. In this case, I was kind of interested in blue and interested in how the blue color kind of could override the named quality of those objects. And here you can see that brownish paint is overlapping a framed leather and a green carpet. So there's a kind of oval that is a painted oval that's kind of hovering kind of next to or alongside a framed piece of leather, a triangular piece of carpet. There's the fan that's plugged in, moving the air, but sort of seems still. I use all different kinds of objects. I generally don't suffer over finding them. I'm not looking for like some eccentric object that you can only buy in New Zealand. I'm using objects that are available. And I go to, Home Depot, I go to used stores, I find things on the street, I have things in my house I don't need anymore. More and more I order things online, I want to glue something, I go to eBay and look up glue, and see what happens. So I'm doing a kind of painting thing, a compositional picture making thing in relationship to stuff, and at some level, it's just stuff. It doesn't matter what it is. Has this thing stopped moving? That means I probably showed you all the images. Let's see what time it is. But of course, that's not entirely true. But I don't come upon things randomly. I have to choose them, and the intersection between this kind of more abstract construction that I'm making and how it bumps into stuff is part of what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in the fact that you can put names to things like fan or carpet or light fixture, but though the named quality of the thing can get lost because the thing is serving a different function in the book. So I should probably finish soon and make room for questions, but I've kind of been experimenting with different structures of presenting my work, and this is one where the kind of images kind of went along and I spoke to them precisely or didn't. And it's a way of trying to manage the fact that there's not one right story to tell about the work. And when I first gave a lecture, 25 years ago or something, and I had 30 slides to show, it was very easy and clear to kind of sequentially go through my images and talk about them. But now it's hard to pick and choose. I kind of want to share the kind of the fullness of what I do and the variety of things I make, but I can't possibly speak to all of it. And so this way of organizing the talk kind of it's kind of improvisational, but it also parallels the way the work is for me. Each work is a kind of cloud of the way things are meaningful. There isn't one structure in the work, there are many. And I think about it a little bit like psychoanalytic theory. If you're looking at a dream from a psychoanalytic point of view, the dream can mean different things at different moments. When you're talking to one person, it might mean something. If you look at it from another point of view, the things in the dream mean something different. And I think that my work is like that. It's a kind of cloud of evocation. And I very precisely don't want those evocations to kind of settle down and be a very clear sentence. I really want the evocations to be a cloud of significance. And the work is meaningful in relationship to how those clouds of significance meet the structures that the work establishes, the formal structure. Maybe I'll just say another few words about color. I think I sort of started as being driven by color. I really love color. And I love that it is both physical and ephemeral. You need light to see color, so light bounces off material things and comes to your eye, and you experience the color as out there, stuck onto things, purple chairs. But you also feel like the light here is kind of warm and yellow because the walls are yellow, so you also feel it kind of as filling up the air. And when you make an object like this one, the experience of it is different depending on where it is, because light's different, and the colors are dependent on the kind of light. So color for me is a place where there's a kind of metaphoric resonance with what it is to be human, where we experience ourselves as physical, but what our feelings and thoughts seem to be disembodied. And I think that there's a kind of parallel there with the experience of color. So maybe that's a good place to stop and answer some questions.
When you're choosing your objects for your sculpture, the smaller one or this one, do you have the sculpture in your mind before you go out and paint them, or do you pick things and then have them all back in the studio and improve them?
There's all kinds of ways that I approach that. For this particular work we're looking at, I just had these things around the studio and kind of played around and made the work. But that's not always the way it is. Sometimes I have really particular ideas in mind. I think I showed you some pieces that were made of ladders, and that was a show at 1301 PV Gallery last summer in Los Angeles, where I made this big kind of lift piece outside. There's a lift with big God's eye on it. So the show was called Lift, and there were ladders that were about lift inside, and the scale of the lift outside was one thing, and the scale of it inside was another, and what lift might mean is multi-valent, all kinds of meanings. So in that case, I had kind of this. I was thinking about what I was going to do outside the building, and then had this idea about, so I was driven by some, contours and thought that way. And when I make the work that's kind of bigger installation works inside, I go and I see the space, and I have floor plans and photographs, and I kind of have a plan of action. I don't really know what the work will look like when it's done exactly, but I have a plan of action that I share with people who help me. And so in those cases, then I kind of, I might say I want a green couch. Well, I actually admit some years ago when I was working in France, I wanted a lime green couch. Lime green in our imaginations is like a bright kind of yellow fluorescent green. Well, they got me a couch the color of a lime, dark green, because it's a language thing, But my work is such that, I didn't say, oh no, I can't use this couch, it's the wrong color. My work is really about the kind of intersection of making do, taking advantage of circumstances and happenstance and accident, and also having a really crisp, very formal sense of what needs to happen, and putting those things together. So I have sort of I guess kind of long answer to your question, but I have a kind of meandering relationship to what materials are. Sometimes they could just be anything that happens to be around, and sometimes I need precisely something and go find it.
I think I remember at the website you talked about you were interested in work with artists and their work. So I'm wondering who tends to help you in your work and how they influence your work.
I'm not sure what you're asking exactly or what you read.
Like how some people influence your work.
Like other artists?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have I don't feel myself to be following a single person, but first of all, I really love Matisse and Cézanne. I love the color in both of those artists, and I love the way they play with space inside of their frames. That there's a kind of uneasy sense of things not settling down. I also see that I follow like Schwitters and Rauschenberg and Frank Stella and Jimmy Pfaff. There's a history of working with material in space that's kind of collage-like sensibility. Cubism, I think, is a pretty influential structuring frame for me, but also for all of us. I think Cubism. The fact that Cubism proposed that we're going to look at a static picture, that picture is not going to tell us what the camera sees. It's going to give us information about moving around in space. I think my work really grows out of minimalism, though my work doesn't appear minimal most of the time. I'm probably the reverse. I think minimalism carved out space for my work to exist in. That minimalism called attention to the experience of the body in relationship to a kind of dumb thing in front of it. And, and called attention to the space around the object and the body moving. So I think my work kind of grows from that. I have to love minimalism. There are lots of, I learn from my students all the time because one of the things, I took the job teaching at Yale, which was kind of the first serious teaching job I had when I turned 40. And I think that was a really good thing to do because I think at that age I could have become very self-involved and kind of just looking at my own thing and kind of forgetting about the world. But teaching, you have to kind of deal with your students who are noticing everything that you might not notice otherwise. And it kind of forces me to be engaged with what's happening around me in a way that's really nice. So lots and lots. I love VR.
There's a lot of language that you use is having to do with the body, whether that's human or the building itself. I want to know how that correlates with what you have in mind, like you want with your work, how the language or how the body influences you.
Well, I think that I had two English parents two English professors for parents. And I grew up in a house with lots of language and argument. And I think that I found that in response to that, I wanted to ascertain what was real. Kind of like, this is my experience. You can't argue it away. And words, my parents, they were always arguing, and there was nobody winning the argument. It just kind of continued. So I think I found that working with material was a way to ascertain some sense of certainty, at least for a moment or two. And I think that language is a very abstract thing, and that language has, I propose, I'm no big expert on this, but a little bit of reading I've done this, and I know people argue about these things, but language is both the result of the structure of our minds that enables us to have language, but also it's developed as metaphor for physical experience. I can't imagine that it's otherwise. And we hold things in mind. Well, is mind an in? Is it a place, or is that's a metaphor? We hold things in mind. We feel blue. It's not because we turn blue. It's because it's a kind of metaphor. Or that was really heavy, what you said. So I think that physical experience underlies language, and so I'm interested in exploring how that's the case, how to make the contours of just being alive, of managing to move through air on Earth in relationship to gravity, something we all share as human beings. There's a lot we don't share, but we certainly share that. That underlies the structure of talking. And, we look at things, these sort of viewed objects, and we spend a lot of time talking about them, and teaching, we talk, we look at things people make, and we talk. But, so the talking and the language and the words feed back into the process of making, and making things certainly respond to all kinds of things we and I read and talk about. But I think that the physicality, the physical formal structure of putting a thing there, it matters to the words. And one can spend all the same time, discussing a paragraph and what that person really meant to say in their paragraph as you can looking at a painting of oranges or something. quite equivalent in a way.
Is there a significance to all the bright colors you use in your work?
Well, I do sometimes try not to use bright colors. I don't know if I showed you, but I have a piece from a number of years ago that's kind of mostly white, and I do really love Robert Ryman's work, and Malevich, white on white. But I can't really escape the colors. Whether they have significance, I don't know. I think that color has an emotional intensity that I value. And I think that the interaction between colors produces a kind of static, it's static, the colors aren't going anywhere, but there's an eventfulness that arises from them, and I really love that.
The Aldrich piece, I'm from Ridgefield, so I know the museum. I remember when they cut down the tree, it was like a really big deal that they were taking down a tree so old. What was it like? Did it feel like you were adding to the history of that tree, or like you were deconstructing the history, or like what was that like for you?
Well, I was, generally speaking, I don't fetishize material or objects. Like I said, I could just use, in some way, it's just stuff. But in that case, I was very aware that people had a lot of feeling for that tree, more than I did. I was a part of that community in the same way. So I didn't feel that I could make something that just got thrown away because people valued the tree. And then also wood and woodworking is a kind of craft that has a resonance that's quite distinct from the collage mishmash that I have here in front of you. So I enjoyed that. I mean, and I would like to kind of get involved in more craft activities, valuing the making that. I'm not a crafts person. I don't have, like I'm not a woodworker, I'm not a potter. But I do think that how things are made is really important, and that how things are made, how the seats you're sitting on are made is important. And the place of making in our economy and culture has huge significance, that we don't make as much as we used to, and that we don't, as a group, really know how things were made. Where, I can imagine a couple hundred years ago, you kind of would have to know how your shoes were made, and clothes, and people, that process of the built environment was closer, and that I can imagine it never looked like this, where everything looked the same. You have a whole room of chairs that all look the same. That's a pretty contemporary fact of being alive. So all of those questions, those kind of noticings about our built environment matter to me a lot. And the ash tree piece was a whole different kind of swing at that. So I welcomed that in the project.
Okay, so you consider yourself a salvage artist, and I was just, and I was saying, speaking from, kind of an anonymous person who's starting out, how do you feel like you start, how do you feel like you got your start? How do you think you got maybe your first show or something like that?
Well,
how do you get that beyond?
I don't know if there's any really good answer to that, that you want to know how to do it yourself. But I grew up in Vancouver, and in Vancouver there were a lot of well-known artists there: Jeff Wall, Ken Lum, Roger Graham. They're all men, and their work is all photo-based. And I think, without thinking about it too much, I just left. I went to New York, and which is a place where a lot of ambitious people go. So I was ambitious and wanted something to happen, and it's not easy to move to New York. It was hard. It was a little easier for me because my parents were from New York, and I had a grandmother there. So it wasn't like, and I went to Yale. I applied to Yale on a whim, and I got into Yale, and Yale was kind of down the street from New York. And it's where I was kind of feeling it, where my parents might have gone but didn't, that part of the world. And so it was easier for me to do than it would have been for many. I was an American citizen, born in Seattle. I had connections to that part of the world. It wasn't like going someplace completely you know, so I put myself in a place where things might happen, and I went to a school that's connected to things happening. But I think it's, you know, part of it's just, you know, I mean, there are a lot of great artists in the world, and I think part of whether or not you have opportunity has to do with whether or not the thing you really care about is having enough cultural resonance that other, you know, that people want to show it and make something happen with it. And that's kind of, I mean, you can't be somebody you're not. You have to make things, I mean, there's no reason to be an artist if you're not making work that you care about, that matters to you. It's like, there's certainly better ways to make a living. So Vineyards is just a kind of happenstance of the moment, whether the things that really matter to you link with others.
So you talk about this universality of these objects. You talk about, I mean, this is, in some ways, it's a curation of these objects. I'm sure you're four fans, you're thinking right hand. Do you have a problem with, or tension maybe, with the inclusion of like yourself in this work? What do you think about it?
Well, I don't think I talked about the objects being universal.
Yeah.
The only thing I said was universal is our experience of gravity. I think the objects are very particular. They're masked, many, I mean, they're all different. They're masked. I mean, I use trees, bits of trees. Those are trees that are kind of local. I use all kinds of things, you know, but our kind of material landscape is a very particular thing at the moment, kind of mass-produced in different countries. A lot of the things around us are kind of nostalgic for how things used to be built. They'll have like basket texture or something printed into plastic, you know. I mean, it's a very particular resonance, all this stuff around us. I have no problem with the work being personal. It's deliberately personal. It's a very personal thing, mushed up against and with things that are shared and not personal. I mean, I don't think that you need to know the story of my life to understand my work. I think that my personal is not so different than a lot of other people's personal. You know, we all have feelings. And how we negotiate and manage feelings is a big part of what we have to do. And I think that I really enjoyed a book by Carol Gilligan called The Rebirth of Pleasure, I remember, A New Map of Love, The Rebirth of Pleasure, in which she proposes that tending to what gives one pleasure is a way to understand the patriarch. She's a feminist, but a very friendly. She's not like a mean feminist. She's a friendly feminist. And she proposes that patriarchal culture structures what's allowed, both for men and for women. And that one way to kind of come to understand the nature of that structuring and to reverse its harms when needed is to tend to pleasure. And what gives a person pleasure matters a great deal. I mean, we all have to kind of orchestrate pleasure. We're pleasure seeking. We eat. You know, we wouldn't eat if it didn't give us pleasure, but we need to eat. So it's kind of a part of being human. Those parts of being human that are part of me and very personal also matter to other people. You know, so those parts of being my person that I manage personally is often shared as a problem to be managed by other people.
I had a question about your use of materials. Oftentimes, like you buy those like you process stuff right out of the shelf, using your work, and it seems like there's a proliferation of mass-produced materials that are going into your work. And I wanted to know if this might be your work is making a statement about consumer capitalism.
Well, that doesn't mean, those words are so quickly kind of mute because they mean so consumer capitalism, and people write volumes about consumer capitalism. So yes, my work is about those volumes, but, yeah. What?
I guess what I'd love to hear.
Well, I care about the fact that people making things is part of being human. That we build our environment. Apple. People love Apple products because they're so well designed. They're so responsive to our sense of use and aesthetics. I mean, the iPhone is one thing, and all those other phones are another. The iPhone really did something special. The other phones all work fine too, but there's something about the attention and care and love that was put into the design. Now, I read Steve Jobs' biography. He wasn't so good at loving people, but he was pretty good at loving that particular quality of material and its relationship to people. And that's the case, that's an essential part of being human. I mean, little kids have to play with clay and paint and draw. It's part of growing up and understanding yourself as a person, even if you never do it again as an adult. You need to do that. And that it then costs, thousands of dollars to buy a table, $10,000, $20,000 to buy a handmade table from somebody down the street, but you can get one for $400 or $500, at IKEA, or even $100 because it's been built in this other way. That the handmade has become the privilege of the very wealthy. There's something kind of ironic and hard about that. That's one, I could say that in relationship to your question. Where things are made, hierarchies in culture are related to capitalist consumerism. I care about those things. I mean, there's so much under that single heading. I care about, when I make those installations at a museum, every museum has a different culture. If the museum is unionized, everybody puts down their tool at exactly 10:30 for their mandated coffee break. It might take twice as long to get the thing hung on the wall because it was halfway up and now has to come down, but the coffee break comes first. Well, that's kind of, and I believe in unions. I think people should get paid well and that unions protect the quality of life of people, but that's a complicated thing in there. I'll go, I can remember being in Germany at a museum and installing a show, and I'm wearing kind of dirty clothes because I'm helping to make this thing, and the curator is wearing a suit, and at lunchtime, the people helping me go and eat lunch in the basement, and I'm invited for lunch with the curator, and I have to change into my better clothes. And so as an artist, I think one of the interesting things about being an artist is your work crosses all these class lines. And you find yourself talking to all kinds of people at different levels and places in society. That's one interesting thing about being an artist. And it's complicated. So I don't like words like consumer capitalism. If I say, yes, my work's about consumer capitalism, it's over, is my work about feminism? Well, yes, in a lot of ways, but it's, I don't, it's because there's some yarn in there. So I'm very suspicious of those kinds of, and there's a history of Marxist criticism in relationship to visual art that is really interesting. And probably the most interesting history of art criticism over the last 50 years or so. But it's also very limiting. And and there's an assumption inside of that history that art is successful when it kind of overturns the status quo, which of course it never does, so it's always failed according to that body of criticism. Well, I don't think that that's a reasonable way to look at art. I think art serves a lot of functions. Sometimes it challenges the status quo. Sometimes it supports the status quo. And, you know, we can't live in the middle of a revolution all the time. We have to live day to day, and hopefully more happily than revolutionary life is, I imagine. So I think art, you know, it enables all kinds of relationships to those questions.
We have time for one more.
And
How often does like music influence any of your work? And if so, are there any like notable artists that influence any of your works or the process? Or
I wish I had a better answer. I don't have a good musical education. My parents told me I was tone deaf and kind of gave up on me. So I don't, and I have a son who wanted to learn to play the violin, and we were resistant because he was very impatient. The violin is hard to play, but we gave him violin lessons, and he can now, he hears the notes and everything. And I'm sure if I would give him violin lessons, I would be able to also. But I like, conceptually, I think music is a really lovely analog to what I do. And like jazz, but I don't like jazz. I don't like listening to jazz that much. I mean, it's not really my thing. But conceptually, there's a really nice analog. When I did take piano lessons really briefly, I had to play Bartok. And I can't stand Bartok. I mean, when I walk into a room and Bartok is playing, everything in me jangles. But actually, I think his music is actually quite aligned to my work in some ways. And I like the way that music is. There seems to be some kind of mathematical structure embedded in music. And also people don't ask, people don't worry about music and its relationship to feeling and meaning. No one looks at, listens to an abstract piece of music and says, well, what does that mean? It's just formalism. But you look at an abstract painting and it's like, well, maybe that doesn't mean anything. So there's a lot I think there's a lot to think about and talk about, and I wish I knew more about music, but I just can't do everything.